Welcome to the Podkey summary of Make Your Game Great with Touch from WWDC 2026. Apple's touch controller framework feels like one of those tools that can quietly make mobile games a lot better when it's used well. The big idea is pretty simple. Touch input gets treated like a real controller, so developers can plug it into the same logic they already use for gamepads. What stands out is how much of the hard stuff it tries to smooth over, from layout across different screens to smarter thumbsticks, cleaner camera control, and on-screen buttons that change with the moment instead of sitting there like dead furniture. At the center of this is the fact that Touch Controller builds on the existing Game Controller API. So for a developer, Touch doesn't have to be some totally separate input system with its own weird rules. It shows up as another GC controller object, which means it can be polled, it can use value-changed handlers, and it can slot into controller logic that may already exist for physical gamepads. That's a pretty practical win, because the less duplicate input code you have, the less likely things are to drift out of sync across devices. There's also a good amount of customization in the button types, and it hooks directly into Metal for performance, which matters when you're trying to keep controls responsive and not feel mushy. And when touch control is activated, the game controller logic comes along automatically, so the handoff from physical controls to touch is much less awkward. One of the nicer design choices here is the anchor-based layout system. Each layout gets 9 anchor points, and developers can assign controls to sections with relative offsets. In plain English, that means the controls keep a sensible size and distance from the edges as you move between an iPhone, an iPad, or even a Mac, instead of turning into a scavenger hunt. Grouping related controls into the same anchored section also helps, because those clusters move together as the screen changes. That cuts down on all the manual repositioning work you'd otherwise end up doing for every shape and size of display. There's also a very welcome emphasis on safe areas. By reading a UI view's safe area insets and folding those into the control offsets, developers can keep touch targets out of the dynamic island, away from the home indicator, and clear of rounded corners. That sounds small until you've tried to hit a button that's half living inside a hardware cutout. It's not a joyful experience. It also pushes designers to think in full screen while still respecting where thumbs actually go, which usually means controls near the edges and not sitting on top of the character or blocking the camera area. Another smart touch is dynamic control icons. Instead of tying a button to a static physical label, like a generic face button, the glyph can reflect the in-game action itself, like strike, fireball, or water. That gives players a quick visual cue about what the button does right now, without asking them to translate from controller language into game language in their head. And if that action changes on the fly, like cycling through powers, the icon can change with it. That kind of context matters a lot more in a fast game than it might sound on paper, because every little bit of reduced mental overhead helps. A lot of this framework seems built around one truth of touch controls. Fingers are not precise, and pretending otherwise just makes people annoyed. For thumbsticks, setting the collider shape to left side or right side expands touch detection to the entire half of the screen. So instead of needing to land exactly on a small visual stick, the player can touch anywhere on that side and get moving. That's especially helpful on larger displays, where hunting for a tiny control with no tactile feedback can feel weirdly harder than it should. The same thinking carries over to camera control with an invisible touchpad on the right half of the screen. A TC touchpad can capture relative finger movement across that whole area, and with reports, relative values turned on, camera rotation responds consistently no matter where the player first touches. That avoids the drift and awkwardness you can get when you try to force camera control into a standard visible thumbstick setup. The Sprint example is a good case of simplifying around what touch devices are actually good at. Instead of making players press a separate sprint button, the game measures how far the left thumbstick is tilted. A light tilt gives normal movement, and a stronger tilt automatically triggers sprint. So sprinting stays a one-finger action, which is a lot friendlier than asking someone to hold movement, hit sprint, and keep everything else under control on a flat screen. There's even custom visual feedback for it. A glowing halo layered over the thumbstick background using TC control contents. That halo appears only when the stick tilt crosses the sprint threshold and disappears when the player drops back to normal movement. It's a clean little signal, and it tells you immediately what state you're in without throwing another chunk of UI in your face. Some of the most interesting ideas here are about reducing complicated inputs into touch-friendly actions. If a game has a combo like holding L1 and R1 during a QuickTime event, the touch version can collapse that into a single on-screen button that appears only when the event happens. That cuts the finger choreography way down, which is really the whole battle on touch. The same goes for aim and release actions. Instead of separate aim and release controls, one button can handle a hold and drag gesture, so the player aims by moving their finger while holding the same control. That's simpler, cleaner, and much easier to execute under pressure. One more idea that's easy to miss, but pretty clever, is using touch controls as output as well as input. So rather than popping a separate power wheel overlay onto the screen, the available powers can appear directly as temporary buttons in the touch interface itself. They show up when needed, disappear after a timeout, and keep the player's attention anchored in the game world instead of bouncing out to a detached menu. That reduces UI layering, which usually means less clutter and faster reactions. It also makes the interface feel more alive, like the controls are part of what's happening instead of a permanent sticker sheet glued on top. Taken together, this framework is really about making touch controls feel less like a compromise and more like a format with its own strengths. When the layout adapts well, the camera behaves, and the controls only ask for the fingers you actually have available. A lot of the usual friction just drops away. And honestly, any feature that saves players from wrestling a virtual thumbstick into a phone corner is doing honest work. This episode was generated by Podkey. Create your own at podkey.fm.